Last week, I shared 7 proven ways to help grow your team, specifically numerically, and it was called Help, I Need Team Members. So, if you haven't watched that yet, you can go back and watch that. It's not necessarily critical or crucial that you watch that first. In fact, I didn't even plan for this to be a part two per se, but as I was reflecting on all this, I was like, man, this would be great a follow up to that because here's what I believe: if if we are merely adding to our teams and not multiplying them, we aren't stewarding the church or our church as well. I firmly believe that. That's why I've chosen to call this developing the leaders around you. And yes, I know that's a Maxwell book, but stick with me and let's dig in together. So, my name is Curtis Biswell. If you haven't been following me so far, this is the Curtis Biswell Show, and my vision is to cultivate a thriving community where worshipers are raised up in character, competence, and cognitive health. And how I plan to do that is by creating transformative content, provide coaching for worship leaders, and connect them to churches in need. Also, I want to apologize. I'm filming this at a different time than I typically do. And so the sun, I'm probably breaking all the the camera rules. I'm not a professional videographer, as you probably already know by now. And so the sun is like peeking through the trees, but I like to use this room because it has some good natural light. So you may be seeing some funky shadows. And if I think that's too distracting, then I will try to make other arrangements and maybe redo it. But I want to share this quote with you today from it's the Disciple Maker podcast. I think it's a great podcast. You can go look that up. This was taken from episode 247. And I don't remember the title of it, but I remember writing this down several years ago, and it has stuck with me thus far. And as I was preparing for the content for today, this was one of the first things that came to my mind. And so let me read this for you, and then we'll kind of unpack this together. Um, it says this, or they said this in that podcast: the sobering truth, what we model, we multiply. Our attitudes, our actions, our appetites, what we model, we multiply. Everyone is making disciples. Everyone is influencing intentionally and unintentionally. But what is modeled through their life, in their life, and with their life, by what is modeled. Everyone is making disciples um, and influencing intentionally and or unintentionally by what is modeled in their lives. The question is, what kind? Because we are influencing all the time. The critical question is, what kind of relationships and disciples and impact are we having in the wake of our influence? Now, this obviously was a quote from a discipling podcast that focuses on discipling practices and all that, right? I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory. Um, and so you may be like, well, why is discipleship important in a worship leading podcast, especially when you've entitled this developing the leaders around you? Well, I feel like it's very important. When I heard this quote years ago, it really rocked my world. That especially that line, what we model, we multiply. And it really caused me to kind of take a good step back and to assess, like, okay, Curtis, how am I doing? Because the question isn't, am I discipling somebody? I am, because we're always influencing. So then it's like, okay, well, how am I influencing? Am I influencing for the good or in bad ways? What is it? Like how am I doing with that? And so I wanted to bring in some scripture today, because that's always a good thing to use. And if you haven't noticed already, I've not once picked up the guitar and showed you something pertaining to worship leadership or approaching a song. I've not once given any type of vocal technique, or I've not even gone into some of these administrative back end tasks that you need to be efficient in as a worship leader. And there's a reason for that. It kind of reminded me of the Friends episode where um, Joey is wanting Phoebe to teach him how to play guitar, but she doesn't want him to touch a guitar for like several weeks. And he finds that very odd because he's trying to learn guitar, but he's not allowed to touch a guitar. Well, it feels like that's kind of what I'm doing here, because I'm not using any practical instruments or techniques, because I'm taking my time with kind of the spiritual components and the mental components, the relational components, and I feel like I'm trying to start with this foundation, to help you as a worship leader. And so enter in Second Timothy 2 verse 2, and here's what it says. This is from the ESV version. Um, it says this: "And what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also." One more time, really quick. "What you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also." I want to break this down for us today, because there's so many good golden nuggets in this one verse, that really encapsulates the point I'm trying to make today about how to develop the leaders around you. Because honestly, guys, this to me, I'm not going to be so bold to say this is the most important thing I've shared with you guys thus far. But if not, it's really close, because I am seeing a major deficiency, if you will, in how we are struggling as a church to develop leaders. I see this all the time. I'm in conversations with pastors and church planners and worship leaders, that have been a part of pastor positions, like, and we see the need for worship leaders, which tells me, okay, either we haven't been taught how to develop others, or we just don't want to. We've gotten so busy in executing Sunday morning and doing it well, to where that's what we're all about. And then what happens is, when that worship leader leaves the church, that church is left scrambling to hire somebody else, and then enter in these hiring agencies. And this isn't a knock on all these hiring agencies. I've gone through some of these myself, but like, to me, we've missed it if we've not taken the time and the investment to develop the next leader. Okay. And so this verse right here, it's kind of four deep, if you will, depending on how you count it. But let me give you some context. So this is Paul writing to Timothy. Probably already knew that, but in case you didn't, Paul is writing to Timothy, and he's the one that is saying, "What you've heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, Timothy, what you've heard me say, Paul, entrust this to faithful men who then will be able to teach others." Okay, so you have Paul, you have Timothy, you have reliable, um, or faithful men, depending on what translation you're reading. This one says faithful men, and then number four, who will be able to teach others also. Okay. So there's kind of like a four deep model, if you will. And so, like, why wouldn't we try to follow this? If this is Paul um, saying this to Timothy, eh, eh, about how to pass on what he's taught him. Now, again, he probably wasn't talking about worship leadership, but this is very, very applicable to what I'm saying today. And so let's get it even a little more personalized, okay? Because you could just be turning me off right there, like, oh, well, that's cool. And maybe I haven't heard that verse. Man, that's powerful. Cool. I learned a good verse today, but like, how am I supposed to apply that? Well, keep sticking with me. Okay. This is a practical way of how this looks. Meeting with mentors, people who are further along than you. Okay. This is a way that this is how it plays out. Like, this is how do you identify Pauls in your life? And again, a Paul would be somebody who's further along, somebody you could look up to. And so, like, this is how it's played out for me. Okay. I remember years ago, I would say the first 7 years of my worship career, if you will, or my journey as a worship leader. Um, like, I don't remember doing a lot of that. Maybe some of that was because I was leading voluntarily at my church, and like, we're talking, I had a full-time job and I was just leading on the weekends, wasn't getting paid much to do it, but I loved it. I knew this was what I was called to do. So I don't really remember. It feels like so long ago. I don't really remember why I didn't see the value then. But then my next ministry, I had more time. I was full time in that, and I don't think that's the only reason why. But something started to click, and I remember before, like, one of the first things I did when I got hired on at that job as a full time worship leader is I started connecting with worship leaders around Kansas City that were older than me, people I looked up to. And I remember specifically sitting down with two or three guys on different occasions and just asking them questions. And that's what I would encourage you to do. Like, find the people further along than you, people that you look up to that's been doing this for a while, and go in with questions written down and like ask them. And there's nuggets that stuck with me. Like, one of them was Troy Kennedy from Westside Family Church. And I specifically remember something he said that has stuck with me and really influenced how I lead in a lot of ways was, the spirit is in the planning. That's what he shared with me. The spirit is in the planning. And so again, it was, I won't unpack that and tell you how that's applied to me because I don't want to make this super long. But that's just an example of, like, this is how this played out for me. Is I started meeting with people. I was identifying Pauls in my life that I could learn from. And I remember a couple years later, there was a period of time I was meeting with a worship leader. In fact, it's Nick Nave. If you know him, shout out to Nick. He's still a buddy of mine to this day, and I just asked him. I said, "Hey, can we meet once a month if you have space? Like, and I'll buy you coffee." And so that went on for a good about 2 years, I think, where we were meeting every month and I was picking his brain and just drafting off him and doing, just kind of being a sponge, soaking up what I could. Um, Looking for faithful men. This is how this played out for me. Like, okay, that was kind of like my Pauls in my life. But looking for faithful men, how that kind of played out for me is something I quickly learned is like, look for provenness. I don't even know if that's a word, but I just made it one. Look for provenness over potential. Man, there is time and time again where the the, the on paper, the talented musician or singer, um it typically would be where, okay, this person is talented and it makes sense to okay, they're my clear next person to start investing in. And a lot of times those people would flake out. And I learned pretty quickly, like, okay, there's more importance to provenness over potential. And I remember one specific way this played out was, um, I remember, like, at the time I needed some drummers, and I had like maybe one drummer, and then I had a young kid. So I had one drummer who had been doing it for years, and he was very skilled musician. Like, I think he overplayed at times. Maybe we all know that drummer that overplays a little bit. I'm not talking quite the Oceans drummer, but so then I had a young kid, who was very raw, and like at first couldn't stay with the click. But like he would show up time and time again, and he was dedicated to learning that, and he became somebody that I would rely on more so than the older drummer, because he was proving himself and he was showing that he was ready to learn and he was teachable. And that's a big deal, finding people who are teachable. If you don't find people who are teachable, then whatever you teach that person won't stick. Then it will stop right there. It won't finish that verse. They won't be faithful, and they for sure won't be able to pass it on to others that will be able to teach others. So you can see how it's quickly addition and multiplication is not happening at that. And then lastly, when it talks about, um looking for faithful men who will be able to teach others also. This is one area, that I started to practice this, in my ministry. Is we were reading this book as a church, and this is a shameless plug, but Ready, Set, Grow. The author's name just escaped me. I think Scott Green. That sounds familiar. I'm gonna edit that if that's wrong. Um, but we were reading that as a staff, and man, honestly, from that time on, that was probably back in 2017 or so, man, I started making a reading plan every year, because I quickly learned, man, um, learners are readers. And that was some of the principles of that book, was it was encouraging his staff to become learners through reading and through podcasts. Those were the two areas that they focused on, and they quickly began to, I say quickly, actually it took about 3 years to see substantial growth, from the staff, because you had to whittle back and like, okay, let's all get on board. And so I adapted something very similar to, just a handful of people on my team that were faithful, they were proven, and I knew that they could carry the baton and they could help me in this multiplication and this developing of others. And so we started, um, reading a couple books together, listening to podcasts, and we would be reporting in, every week or so. And so that's just one small example of how you can kind of start to teach, those faithful men and women, and you can equip them to be able to do that to others. So I want to start to kind of wrap this up some, and as I do, I just want to share this kind of sobering story of why this is so important for us to be doing as worship leaders specifically, but really leaders in general, is to developing the leaders around you. I, for sake of honor and honesty, I'm gonna be very vague in this story, but I observed this church. This has been a while back ago. This church had a good culture of developing other leaders. They were decent sized church, few different campuses, and they were doing a pretty good job at raising up leaders and even sending some leaders out. Okay, well, they have a change in leadership pertaining to the worship, and the person that they hire, let's just call him Fred. Fred was had an exceptional resume. Been doing music for a long time, and been with some pretty big bands and production, all that stuff, right? Well, Fred doesn't even quite make it a year at the church. Um, and again, I don't know all the details. Again, I was just observing from afar, and it appeared that one of the main contributors to that was Fred was great at executing Sunday, but not super great at developing the leaders around him. And and so that shows the importance. That's just one story of many. The importance of why we should be investing in the ones around us, giving leadership away, looking for people who can do the job 70%, 80%, whatever your percent is, as good as you, giving some of that leadership away, um, and equipping them to be able to pass on. So you're multiplying and you're developing the next generation of leaders. And so this is kind of my call to action. I want you to ask yourself 5 questions, and you're like, he's giving me homework. Just take an assessment of yourself. Okay. Question one: do I have any Pauls or Paulines in my life? People further along than me. Do I have those? Question number two: are there people in my life that have proven themselves? You know, a quick little caveat here, or a quick little example here. Abner. Abner is a great leader on my team. He's been with me for a few years now. Abner is super talented. Like, can play pretty much every instrument, leads, very organizational. Like, just fills all those, or checks all those boxes. But you know why I appreciate Abner? Is because Abner was always like one of the first ones there, one of the last ones to leave, always asking, "Hey, what do you need help with? How can I help?" Like, so look for those people in your lives, in your team, on your team. Question number three: how are you equipping those those Abners, if you will, those faithful people? Um, how are you equipping them to invest in others? Like, what's some processes and ways that you're doing that? Like, I know that was a episode a couple episodes ago about the benefit of a org chart on your worship team. And some of my principles of that was what I was just saying about that percentage of, like, okay, we aren't meant to wear all the hats. And so, how can you start giving hats away, giving leadership away? Okay. Like, what are the ways that you're doing that? And honestly, like, we have a proven system that's nothing new. Like, if you've heard of the leadership square is as simple as this. Point number one: I do, you watch. Point number two: I do, you help. Point number three: you do, I help. Point number four: you do, I watch. So, like, right there's a simple model. Put that into practice. Like, how are people shadowing you? What are you giving them things to do and you're helping them with? And then, how are you giving things fully away and just watching them? Like, follow those steps. Question number four: if you were to divide up your time percentage wise, and I know this can be tricky because, like, some of us are bivocational, some of us are very volunteer, but you get you get the point here. Like, if you were to divide up your time, what percentage of that is spent in developing faithful men and women? That could be a sobering question. And last question, which is similar to that one: if you were to divide up your time, what percentage is spent in developing yourself? And maybe that's through Pauls and Paulines, mentors, podcasts, books, conferences, like, you fill in the blank. But those are just 5 good questions to kind of take a good assessment of your ministry right now. And man, if if you are looking for somebody to be a Paul in your life, um, somebody to be a mentor, a coach, I would love to have a conversation with you. And so like I'm opening up some coaching spots where I like would love to be able to help you grow in character and competence and cognitive health and pastoral leadership, musical excellence, administration, like all the things that takes to be a worship leader in today's age. Okay. And so if that's something you're looking for, don't hesitate. Send me a comment or email me at curtisbiswell@gmail.com. And how we would go about this is just set up a free discovery call and I could kind of get an assessment of what are your goals? What are you looking for? What is your context? What is your needs? And then we could see if I could be a good fit. And if not, that's okay too. But my point is find those Pauls in your life. So I hope today was beneficial. I hope it got you to kind of be thinking um, and to see the importance of developing the leaders around you. And so God bless and stay tuned for the next episode.